Alright guys, how's it going? We're back with another lens review today. We're going to be looking at a really cool wide-angle lens released by Canon. It's the 16-35 f4 L series lens. An absolute beauty of a lens. I know there is the 2.8 version that was released, but there's some good reasons why we'll be taking a look at the f4 today. Mostly to do with its specs versus its price. So you're going to get a really high quality lens for a fraction of the cost of what you'd be paying for the 2.8. And for anybody out there like me who's an indie filmmaker, doesn't have too much cash to throw around into their productions, this is the kind of lens that's going to give you the quality of an L series lens without the massive price tag. So the lens has got a maximum aperture of f4 and a minimum aperture of f22, which is pretty standard for most Canon L series glass. The lens construction is 16 elements in 12 groups, and it has 9 aperture blades which produce 18-point stars when shooting at minimum apertures, so anything from around 18 and up. The minimal focusing distance is 28 centimeters with a weight of approximately 615 grams, as opposed to the 2.8 version, which is 635. Now that just comes from the fact that the 2.8 has a larger aperture. So anybody has seen the super wide angle Tamron lens that they just released, the 2.8, it's an absolute monster of a thing. And that just comes down to the fact that it has got a larger aperture and needs wider glass. The lens is running a USM motor, which is an ultrasonic motor, so you're going to get really quick, really smooth focusing, and that's going to be extremely accurate. The filter thread's at 77 mils as opposed to the 2.8, which is running at 82 millimeters. So if you were to choose between the two, you've got the standard 82 mil filter that you get on most of your 2.8 lenses as opposed to the 77 that you get on your standard f4 lenses. So if you've got a couple of polarizers or whatever, those will be interchangeable with your other L series lenses. And can I just say, thank God that this lens has a a filter thread on it, so you can throw something like a UV filter on it. Last time I was in New Zealand, I was taking a couple of location shots and I was just walking through bush and stuff, and stupidly I forgot to put my lens cap back on. And since the front of my lens is domed, it kind of protrudes a bit, and as I was pulling it up to take a photo, it nicked a freaking, like a branch or something that was sticking out. And now every time I go and take a photo or a video, I have to go through and have a look for that dot and make sure I delete it, or clone stamp it out, or whatever it is that I have to do, but I always have to look for that correction. So the fact that this wide angle can fit a filter is great. Buy one, stick it on your lens and never take it off, because it'll save you stupid mistakes like that. So shooting with wide angle, you're always going to have some issues with perspective. Now that just comes from the fact that you're pulling such a I guess a wide field of view onto such a small sensor. Even if you are shooting full frame, you're going to get a little bit of distortion in the edges, and you're going to get a really weird effect where distance from the lens to your subject is skewed or distorted. So for example, this is making my arm look extremely long, like the shot in The Matrix where they're fighting on the roof and he pulls out the gun and it just stretches his whole arm out. That's kind of how they got that effect, by using a really wide angle lens that has a lot of perspective distortion. In terms of the warping on the edges of your screen, anybody who has Photoshop or Lightroom and kind of has a basic understanding of how it works, you should be able to remove that distortion fairly easily. When you bring your raw images into Photoshop, you just click your lens profile and it pretty much figures it out on its own. Otherwise you can go through and play with warp tools and all sorts of stuff internally, but I didn't bother with that. I just clicked that lens profile, sorted it out for me. Now for those of you who are like, why would I bother buying the f4 version when there's a perfectly good 2.8 out there? Listen, if you've got the cash to throw around, go for it, go wild. This is for me personally. If I had to choose between the two, I'd go the f4. I mean, how many of you are going to go and take a photo of a landscape and have enough depth of field to shoot that whole landscape at f4, at f2.8, sorry? It doesn't really make too much sense to me. I'd rather have a lens that's going to be shooting with a large enough depth of field that I'm going to get everything in focus. I mean, there are occasions where you're going to want to get things in the foreground out of focus if you're doing a fairly low shot, something that's quite low to the ground, but in most cases when I'm doing my portrait, my landscape, sorry, it's from f4 and up. Sometimes 3.5 depending on the shot, how far away my subject is, so on and so on. But generally it's around f4 that I'm shooting on anyway. The lens is also weather sealed, which is great for if you're going out early morning. You might get a little bit of dew, or there's a little bit of like, what would you call it, condensation and things that form around your camera gear. I'm sure if you've been up early enough, you'll have seen it, but it means that condensation and that residue isn't going to get into the lens, and it's going to reduce the risk of you getting any sort of fungus or anything growing inside of your lens, which unfortunately can happen when you're going out early mornings all the time. So you'll save yourself a couple of services and a bit of money, which is great. Another thing that's really interesting about this lens is that it's image stabilized, and I'm sure some of you guys are like, why would you image stabilize a wide angle lens? It's not like you're shooting telephoto where every single move you make is amplified. But it kind of is. Like, if you consider shooting on such a wide frame, you're taking so much more of the background in, and every movement is exaggerated because you've got so much in view. Whereas like a 50mm or a 35 or an 85, kind of that middle ground, you don't really get as much vibration and shake and warp. But with a lens like this, where you're playing with perspective and you've got so much in view, having that stabilization can save your shots. If you're shooting on a tripod, turn it off. You don't need to have your image stabilization if you're using something to stabilize your photos. It's just going to create a little bit of barreling and movement, and you probably don't want that if you're producing a very calculated shot. But in saying that, the IS is extremely quiet. So if you're shooting video and you want a little bit of extra stabilization, if you're handheld or whatever, feel free to leave that going on because it's extremely quiet. You're only really going to hear it when you're turning the camera on and turning the camera off. So yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of just taking a look at the specs and what I kind of understand about the lens. But let's go straight in, let's unbox this guy, and I'll show you exactly what you can expect to see from taking this guy out the box. Alright guys, so as you can see, a little bit has changed. I got a bit of feedback recently saying that you guys were a bit more interested in seeing an unboxing as opposed to kind of product shots, and that's totally cool. So I'm going to get straight in and unbox this guy and show you what's actually in the box and talk you through the lens that way, which I think is a little more similar to the previous reviews that I've done, rather than the last one, which was the 24 to 70 f2.8 review. Straight out the box, you've got your lens bag. Again, it's a pretty decent bag, but it's not going to provide you with a lot of protection. It's basically there as like a dust cover, like what you would have for a car. Keep it out of the weather. It's got a nice hard bottom, so if you're putting it onto, you know, shelves and things, it's not going to do too much damage if you put it down a little bit harder. And then you've got the lens itself. Now this guy, like I was saying before, he weighs about 615 grams. So it weighs about 615 grams, relatively light for a wide angle lens. I mean, there's a lot that usually goes into these guys, and for one that's this wide, it is relatively light, which is great, I think, especially if you're doing your landscapes and things. You don't want to be carrying tons of weight as you're walking around and such. You've also got on the side your autofocus and manual switches. Then down the bottom, your image stabilizer. So you can see those two there. The lens, I'd say it's got about 90 degrees of throw in your focus, which, I mean, you're not going to worry about that too much with a lens that's at f4. And then here you've got your zoom ring, nice and easy. The filter thread on this guy is a 77mm, as opposed to the version 2.8 version of this lens, which is an 82. Both relatively standard sizes for the apertures that they're working with. Yeah, and then you've got the back side of this guy. Really gorgeous, gorgeous glass, great movement. Doesn't telescope, which is nice. I'm a big fan of lenses that function within the barrel. They don't get larger or small, so you know exactly how long your lens is when you're using it. I know it seems like a little thing, but it's something to be cautious of, or something to kind of be aware of. And again, having a filter thread on this guy is amazing. Even though it is slightly domed at the front, like most wide angle lenses are, you can still fit a filter on there, which is amazing. I can't say it enough. If you can put a filter on a lens, especially a lens that's this expensive, you should definitely do it. It's going to save you a lot of money in the long run, and a lot of stress. Standard Canon lens hood. These guys are quite good. I think most lenses you should keep your lens hoods on when you're shooting outside. These guys are especially good, the Canon L series ones, because they're actually kind of like a felt inside. So even though they are hard plastic, they're not going to bounce light back against itself and then back into the lens, which is really good. And then yeah, with the quick the release button there, so you know it's not going to accidentally twist off of the front of your lens or change direction mid-shot or whatever it is. You know it's always going to be locked in secure. So when you put those guys together, what you're going to get is a configuration kind of like this. So relatively compact, quite small. It's going to be nice and easy to shoot with, not too cumbersome. Really lightweight lens. Yeah. So I guess what we'll do, I took a few photos on this guy yesterday, a couple days ago I think. And we're going to jump into Photoshop now, take a look at those, and I can talk you through some of the amazing images that you can get and some of the great things about this lens. So yeah, let's jump straight in and do that. Okay, so I've gone and taken an image straight out of the camera and smacked it into Photoshop. I haven't done any sort of post-correction, anything like that, so it's raw, straight from the camera. What we can see here is a relatively sharp, crisp image. I mean, I did shoot handheld and it was at sunset, so there wasn't a lot of light. But, I mean, considering the conditions, I think it's a relatively sharp image. Another thing to note is that there isn't a lot of barreling, there isn't a lot of distortion in the edges of the frame here. Or vignetting for that matter. I think there's a tiny bit up here, maybe a half a stop, but that's about it. In terms of sharpness, if we take a look, I'd say the sharpest point is about here, really, in the center of the road, or even along here. So if that's your sharpest point there, you've got some really hard lines, a tiny bit of, it looks like a bit of blue chromatic aberration, but very minimal, very minimal. And if we were to compare that to the edge of frame here, you can see that again it is quite sharp. There is a little bit of noise coming from the fact that we're shooting at a higher ISO. But I mean, apart from that, you can see even on this side, which was slightly behind point of focus, you can still see very hard lines, a little bit of blue chromatic aberration again, just coming out underneath those letters. Yeah, it looks like just a little bit of blue. In terms of barreling, if you were to compare, I guess, the edge of this building here to the edge of frame, you can see that it is still very straight. There's no warping, no barreling. Very minimal distortion, if any. In terms of fall off, I'm not 100% on the fall off of this lens. I think again, with a lower ISO, you're going to get nicer detail. But I was just working with what I had and running gunning on the fly. So the fall off on this lens isn't amazing. I mean, keep in mind we are at 200% magnification here, but yeah, personally, in my particular preference, I don't really like the fall off or the bokeh on this lens. And again, the sharpness, look at that, right at the edge of frame, and still amazingly sharp. Amazingly sharp. Going back to the f4 versus f2.8 debate, at f4, shooting at the minimum aperture here, you can still see there's a little bit of softness in the foreground. Our background is a little bit soft as well, and if I wanted to, I could just increase the intensity of that. I could add a mask or a vignette or something like that to have a bit of a play with the focus in this image. But if you were to shoot it on 2.8, you wouldn't have the luxury of being able to do that in post, because you would have already set your the image, you would have shot it, and you wouldn't be able to take back those details in the edges if you wanted to. Which for me, I really prefer being able to get everything that you need out of the image, straight out of the camera, and then going into post and playing around and adding those effects. With portraiture, it's a little bit different. I do like nice soft features with portraiture, but for landscapes and this style of photography, I do like to just capture as much information as possible, and from there be able to go through and play with the image as I see fit. Yeah, so in terms of the image stabilization on this lens, this was handheld at a relatively low shutter speed. And you can see, like, these vehicles, sorry, would be moving along here, and you know, I would have just been, I was pretty much just throwing my camera around that day, but you can see that it's little to no camera shake, I would say. So yeah, even shooting this guy handheld for just happy snaps if you're going on vacation, or if you just want a nice street photography lens that you can be really quick with, it does a great job. It takes an excellent photo, and it's definitely one to chuck into the camera kit if you get the opportunity to. So there you have it, guys. That's the 16-35 f4 Canon L series lens. Excellent lens, absolutely amazing lens. I'm so glad that I've had a chance to take a look at it and have a play with it. If you can, grab this guy, chuck him in your kit because he does a great job. The 16-35 f2.8 is retailing at about $1,500 as opposed to this guy, which is retailing at about $1,227. If you're the sort of person who goes, all right, I just want to get the best, I want to get the top of the line, even if it costs me a little bit extra, pay the extra $300. If not, grab yourself a 16-35 f4 because it's going to do an amazing job. It's a really beautiful lens. I don't think the extra $300 is really worth it at the end of the day, in my personal opinion. I mean, I'm sure there are people out there who have shot on the f2.8 and absolutely love it. But a lens that's got very minimal chromatic aberration, has very minimal vignetting, is lighter, has, you know, cheaper filters, you know, all of that stuff. I just think that in the long run, this is probably a better lens for me if I was to pick between the two. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully you learn a little bit about the lens. And I guess we'll see you guys soon. Bye. Alright guys, thanks again for tuning in. If you click the link on the left, it'll take you to the 24-70 f2.8 lens review. Otherwise, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and as always guys, keep on chilling.